The room went dead silent when she walked past Dr. Pierce Mercer's office. 8 months. That's how long Natalie Hayes had been at St. Michael's in Colorado Springs, and in that time she'd become the kind of nurse who made senior physicians uncomfortable, not because she made mistakes, but because she didn't make any. Her hands moved through the ICU with the kind of precision that came from somewhere else, somewhere deeper than a standard nursing degree. She adjusted full lines with her fingers spread in a way that suggested she'd done it under different conditions. Worse conditions. Her assessments came out clipped and accurate, recommendations that were rarely wrong, confidence that filled the space around her like something solid. Dr. Mercer saw all of this and read it as threat. He leaned against his desk that October morning, watching her through the hallway window as she moved from bed to bed on the ICU floor. No master's degree on her wall. No fellowship credentials. No letters after her name. Just a Colorado nursing license and hands that seemed to know things they shouldn't. He'd checked her file twice. 8 months of stellar evaluations, 0 complaints, and the kind of rapport with patients that made families trust her immediately. They asked for her by name. That was the problem. Mercer had spent 17 years building his reputation at St. Michael's. 17 years of being the voice people listened to, the hands people trusted, the mind that solved the impossible cases. He'd published papers. He'd served on committees. His photo was in the hospital lobby. And now there was this woman, this nurse, not even a doctor, moving through his ICU with the bearing of someone who'd made life-and-death decisions before breakfast. The thing that twisted deepest was that she never challenged him directly. She was polite. Deferential, even. She said yes, doctor, and of course, doctor, and still somehow made him feel like the intern in the room. He watched her bend over the patient in ICU bed 7, the unconscious Admiral who'd arrived 2 days ago by private transport, sedated and unresponsive, diagnosis still being sorted. The Admiral's chart was classified. Mercer wasn't cleared for the details, which meant someone higher than hospital administration had made that call. That detail alone should have made Mercer cautious. Instead, it made him territorial. Natalie's fingers found the Admiral's wrist without looking. Pulse check. She moved to his neck next, carotid assessment, her touch light as a nurse's should be. But her eyes. Her eyes were scanning him like she was reading a tactical map. Mercer had never seen a nurse look at a patient that way. Analytical. Professional. Like she was doing inventory. She adjusted his oxygen saturation monitor, leaning close enough that her hair brushed the bed rail. That's when Mercer saw it, a small, faded military unit patch sewn inside the collar of her jacket, visible only because she'd bent forward. Worn fabric. Very worn. Older than 8 months. Older than most things in the hospital. Her fingers brushed it absently as she straightened, the kind of unconscious gesture that suggested habit. Ritual, even. Mercer made a note of it mentally and filed it away with all the other contradictions about Nurse Natalie Hayes. The antiseptic smell of the ICU was sharp that morning, mixed with the rubber and plastic scent of the ventilator hose snaking across the Admiral's chest. Natalie breathed through her mouth as she checked the medication drip, a small tactical choice that most people wouldn't notice. She'd learned it on a cot in Helmand Province, learned it when the air itself could carry infection, learned it when a single breath could mean the difference between healing and sepsis. The Admiral's eyes were closed. They'd been closed for 46 hours now, ever since he'd arrived at St. Michael's in whatever condition had required a classified admission and a sedation protocol that only 3 people at the hospital had been briefed on. Natalie was the 4th, but that 4th briefing had come from someone who wasn't hospital administration. Someone with credentials that didn't appear in the building directory. She looked at his left forearm, at the tattoo that had never faded in 5 years of sun exposure and muscle development. The name Hayes in Marine Corps letters, done on base at Camp Lejeune before deployment, done by a tattoo artist who worked out of a converted barracks room and charged in beer. She remembered the day he'd shown her, proud as a kid, grinning like he'd just summited Everest. She'd laughed at him then, genuinely laughed, a luxury that didn't exist anymore. Hayes. Her last name. His way of remembering. She didn't let her hand linger. She checked the foreport for patency, verified the saline flow rate, made notes on his chart in the precise clinical shorthand that meant nothing to civilians and everything to people who understood. 0600, vital stable. Sedation holding. Neuro checks unchanged. Nothing that would draw attention. Nothing that would suggest that the woman writing those notes was the same person who'd carried him 3 miles through fire, his blood soaking through her uniform, his weight nearly collapsing her spine with every step, his life depending on her legs not stopping. The patch inside her jacket collar felt heavier on mornings like this. She touched it unconsciously as she left the Admiral's bedside, her fingertips finding the worn threads like a prayer. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, Helmand Province 2019, the unit she'd served with, the unit she'd lost people from, the unit she'd come back from still alive but fundamentally changed. The patch reminded her every morning why she was here. Not for recognition. Not for the tattoo on the Admiral's arm. Not for the way her name had echoed through the ranks as a legend that didn't match the face of a nurse in scrubs. She was here because intelligence had suggested someone inside St. Michael's was targeting high-ranking military patients. Targeting them quietly. Professionally. And the Admiral was too valuable to risk to civilian protection protocols. The Navy had sent her, Captain Natalie Hayes, combat surgeon, placed under civilian cover with a nursing credential that was real but incomplete, her actual expertise locked away in a classified file at the Pentagon. Her job wasn't to heal the Admiral. Her job was to keep him alive until they figured out who wanted him dead. The monitoring was secondary. The protection was primary. Mercer was waiting at the nurse's station when she turned from the Admiral's room, his posture casual but his eyes tracking her movements with the precision of a predator. He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. She'd learned to read that distinction, the difference between a smile that meant something and a smile that was a tool. "Thorough this morning," he said. "Just routine," Natalie replied. Her voice came out soft, the way she'd trained it to sound since day one at St. Michael's. Deferential. Non-threatening. The voice of a woman without secrets. The Admiral's assessment. Mercer moved toward her, closing the space in a way that was meant to make her uncomfortable. It didn't. Stable. Sedation's holding. No changes from overnight. You seem very familiar with his case. Not a question. An observation with teeth. Most staff rotate through the Admiral's room. You've been pulling 12-hour shifts near his bed. She could have explained it. Could have cited routine protocol, patient care standards, anything that would have sounded reasonable to a doctor who didn't know what she actually was. Instead, she just met his eyes and held her expression level. Neutral. Unremarkable. He's still settling from transport, she said. New patients require extra monitoring. Something flickered across Mercer's face, frustration, maybe, or the beginning of suspicion. She'd seen both before. She knew how to handle both. She waited, perfectly still, her hands loose at her sides, her breathing steady. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that constant electrical buzz that meant normal functioning hospital morning. Around them, alarms beeped in regular patterns. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythms. The fore-pump clicked its measured cadence. The rotor wash sound of a departing helicopter rolled past the windows in the distance, barely audible, the kind of sound that would have made her instantly alert 6 years ago. Now it just registered as environmental noise, one more piece of the world that had changed since she'd left the military. "Well," Mercer said finally, "try not to overstep your scope of practice. We have protocols for a reason." "Yes, doctor." She said it the way she'd trained herself to say everything, quiet, compliant, invisible. Not the way a captain would say it. Not the way someone who'd earned a Navy Cross under fire would say it. Not the way a woman who'd kept a flag officer's heart beating through an insurgent ambush would ever naturally speak. Mercer nodded, apparently satisfied, and turned back toward the Admiral's room for his own assessment. Natalie stood motionless at the station, her fingers absently finding the unit patch under her collar again, touching that worn fabric like it was an anchor. Like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to something that made sense. She had orders. Protect the Admiral. Stay invisible. Don't blow your cover. And when this was over, when the threat had been identified and neutralized, she'd go back to being just another nurse in the system, a person without a name, a person who'd never told anyone the truth about her hands or her history or the reason she could read a trauma case the way other people read highway signs. But in the Admiral's room, still sedated and unaware, the man who'd gone into battle beside her would never know that his guardian was the one checking his vitals every 4 hours. Would never connect the name on his skin to the face above him. Would never understand that the quiet woman in scrubs was the legend he'd been told about in the hospital's classified briefing, the one they'd been vague about, the one they'd called by her unit designation instead of her name. Phantom. That's what they called her. The name that had meant something when it mattered. The name that meant nothing here. She moved back toward the Admiral's room to take another set of vitals, her footsteps silent on the tile floor, her presence already forgotten by Mercer, already written off as routine nursing competence and nothing more. That was the mission. Stay invisible. Keep him alive. Let no one know who was really standing guard. But that wasn't the worst part of what Mercer didn't know. What they whispered was simple. What they believed was simpler still. They called her overconfident. They called her reckless. They didn't know she'd carried a flag officer 3 miles through Helmand Province while rounds tore past her shoulders. They didn't know that the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining had been stitched by the hands of a Marine who didn't make it home. Dr. Mercer saw something different in Natalie Hayes. He saw a woman without the credentials to match her competence, without the title to justify her presence, without the humility to accept her place. And he was going to fix that. It started with whispers in the tight space outside Operating Room 3, where the fluorescent lights cast shadows deep enough to hide in. Dr. Mercer leaned close to Chief of Staff Richardson, voice low enough that only the two of them could hear, his tone carrying the weight of reluctant concern. I hate to bring this up, but I've noticed Nurse Hayes making clinical decisions without consulting attending physicians. Small things. A vasopressor adjustment here, an oxygen titration there. Protocol violations, technically. Nothing I can prove yet, but... He let the silence finish the sentence. Richardson's jaw tightened. That was all Mercer needed. One seed planted in the right soil. The casual mentions followed during rounds, delivered with the precision of someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of institutional sabotage. Dr. Mercer would stand at the foot of a patient's bed, his voice carrying across the room with casual authority. Nurse Hayes, can you walk me through the clinical reasoning for that intervention? Just want to make sure we're staying within scope. The residents would exchange glances. The other nurses would pull back slightly. Scope became the word that hung in the air, scope of practice, scope of authority, scope of what a nurse should know. Each time he said it, Natalie could feel the shift in how people looked at her. The respect that had been building, brick by brick over 8 months, started to crack. By the second week, the break room emptied when she entered. She'd walk through the door with her lunch container and find the table of 4 nurses, Chen, Rodriguez, Martinez, 2 of whom she'd trained during her first month, would suddenly remember urgent tasks elsewhere. Chairs would scrape back. Eyes would find the floor. One of them, Martinez, had actually thanked her 3 months ago for catching a medication error that could have landed him in front of the state board. Now he wouldn't hold her gaze. The isolation was absolute and precise. Natalie would sit alone with her sandwich, her measured breath the only sound, and eat while staring at the space where people used to be. She didn't let anyone see the single tear escape during those lunches. She'd wipe it away with the back of her hand the moment it appeared, the same way she'd learned to do in a field hospital in Jalabad when a Marine under her hands coded and there was nothing left to do but move to the next one. The public humiliation came on a Tuesday afternoon when Admiral Harrington's daughter visited from Washington, D.C., a woman in a charcoal blazer with the same jawline as her father, her presence carrying the weight of someone used to being heard in rooms where decisions mattered. Natalie was checking the Admiral's vasopressor infusion when Dr. Mercer's voice cut across the room like a blade. Nurse Hayes, did you authorize an increase in his vasopressor drip without my order? His volume was deliberate. His tone was sharp. His audience was perfect: the Admiral's daughter, 2 residents, and a nursing student who would carry the story through the hospital by dinner. Natalie set down her tablet with the same calm she'd used to secure a tourniquet on a femoral bleed while incoming fire shredded the tent canvas around her. One measured breath. His pressure dropped to 60/30 at 0400, doctor. The standing protocol allows nursing staff to titrate vasopressors within a 10-point range if the attending isn't immediately available. His systolic was at 55. I documented it. The order was written within protocol. She'd kept her voice level. She'd kept her hand steady. She'd spoken with the clinical precision that came from years of making life-and-death decisions in environments where no attending physician existed and the weight of survival rested entirely on her shoulders. Dr. Mercer's smile was a weapon. The standing protocol allows you to page the attending, not play doctor. You're a nurse, Nurse Hayes. I suggest you act like one. The word play hung in the air like an accusation. Like incompetence. Like overreach. Like she was some ambitious technician trying to climb above her station instead of a captain in the Navy Reserve trying to stay invisible. The Admiral's daughter's eyes dropped to her phone. The residents shifted their weight. The nursing student's pen stopped moving. Natalie felt the tear escape then, the one she hadn't been able to hold back in the privacy of her car or her kitchen or the shower where no one could hear her. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with Mercer. Without apologizing. Without shrinking. When she spoke, her voice was steady as surgical steel. I've been corrected by better men than you, doctor. Many of them are buried under 6 feet of Afghan dirt. I'll take their lessons over your lectures. The room went so quiet you could hear the 4-pumped soft mechanical hiss. The Admiral's daughter looked up from her phone. The residents exchanged glances that might have been respect or might have been the understanding that Natalie Hayes had just ended her career at St. Michael's with 8 words and a stare. Mercer's face darkened, and Natalie recognized the expression of a man who'd expected submission and found something else entirely. He left without another word. That was when she knew he'd moved to something worse. The formal write-up was posted on the unit board by Thursday morning, the same board where the daily census and staffing updates and birthday announcements lived. Her name was in bold at the top: Incident Report, Nurse Natalie Hayes. Citation: Insubordination. Unauthorized clinical judgment. Disrespect to attending physician. Dated and signed by Dr. Mercer with the Chief of Staff's countersignature underneath. By noon, she heard the night shift nurses had photographed it. By evening, she knew the entire hospital had seen it. The isolation deepened. The few nurses who still made eye contact did so with pity, the expression people wear when watching someone's professional reputation dissolve like sugar in water. What Dr. Mercer didn't understand was that she'd endure worse than isolation, worse than public humiliation, worse than the systematic dismantling of her credibility if it meant staying in the Admiral's proximity. The mission wasn't about her pride or her reputation at a civilian hospital. The mission was protecting a man who'd once ordered his entire unit to hold position while she performed emergency field surgery on a child bleeding out from an IED fragment wound, his body shielding her from the sniper fire coming from the ridge line. The mission was staying close enough to watch for the internal threat that intelligence suggested was already inside St. Michael's. The mission was everything. Her comfort was nothing. But that night, when she got home to the small rental house in the northeast quadrant of Colorado Springs, her 14-year-old son Marcus looked up from his physics homework and asked why she was so quiet. Why she'd been so quiet all week. She couldn't tell him that she was watching a man die by degrees in a hospital bed while pretending to be less than she was. She couldn't tell him that the whispers and the stares and the write-up were part of a role so deep that sometimes she forgot where the cover ended and where Captain Natalie Hayes actually began. So she told him she was just tired. She told him the shifts were long. She told him things would get better, and she meant it with every fiber of her being, because the alternative, that she'd blown her cover, that she'd shown too much competence, that she'd attracted the kind of attention that would get her removed from this hospital and reassigned somewhere else, was unthinkable. What happened next would prove her instinct was correct. What happened next would prove that Dr. Mercer's campaign of whispers and humiliation was only the opening move in a much longer game. Day 12 of the Admiral's coma, and Natalie noticed what the monitors couldn't say aloud. The lactate climbing. 4.2, then 4.8. The peripheral perfusion declining in his extremities, skin mottling at the edges where pink should be. She pressed her fingertip against his forearm and counted, capillary refill time stretched to 3 full seconds. A body doesn't do that because it's simply unconscious. A body does that because something inside is dying. She had touched this man's chest in Helmand Province with her hand shaking not from fear but from knowing that if she didn't move faster, the flag officer bleeding out on that hillside 3 miles from FOB Shank would be flag draped instead of flag promoted. 5 years had passed. His name was still tattooed on his forearm in blue ink. The faded unit patch she kept sewn inside her jacket lining, the one she touched every morning before shift, belonged to his command. And now something was happening to him that the sedation didn't explain. Something deliberate. Natalie checked the foreport at 1900 hours. The saline bag hung clear and colorless. But when she traced the line with her fingers, feeling the plastic tubing like a surgeon reading braille, she found what the pharmacy logs wouldn't show. Tiny abrasions inside the port. The kind that came from repeated entry with a needle that wasn't sterile. The kind that introduced bacteria directly into the bloodstream. Sepsis didn't announce itself with red flags and alarms. It whispered. It started with climbing lactate and peripheral shutdown. It moved like an assassin through the bloodstream, and by the time the fever spiked and the culture came back, the patient was already dead. Someone was poisoning him. She documented nothing. Wrote nothing. Called nobody. Because calling somebody meant explaining how she knew the difference between accidental contamination and methodical sabotage, and that explanation led directly to the tattoo on the Admiral's forearm and her name and the reason a Navy captain was working 12-hour shifts as a hospital nurse in Colorado Springs under orders that said, "Find the threat inside St. Michael's. Protect the asset. Do not reveal yourself." At 02 for 7 hours, the Admiral's monitor screamed. Ventricular fibrillation. The heart not beating but trembling, electrical chaos with no forward motion, no blood reaching the brain, no blood reaching anywhere. Natalie was already moving before the second alarm sounded. 3 steps to the crash cart. She grabbed the defibrillator pads, ripped open his gown, pressed the adhesive squares to his chest with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this in a forward surgical team tent while incoming rounds shook the canvas roof. Charged to 200 joules. Clear. His body convulsed against the electricity like a caught fish, then flatlined into asystole. Dead rhythm. Worse than fibrillation because at least fibrillation was trying. Code blue, ICU bed 7. Code blue, ICU bed 7. The overhead voice traveled through the hospital like a prayer nobody believed in anymore. She began compressions. Her hands found the center of his chest, the heel of her left palm locked over her right fist, and she began the rhythmic crushing that breaks ribs and saves lives. 30 compressions. 2 rescue breaths. 30 compressions. The residents arrived in ones and twos, moving with the slack confusion of people who'd never seen a heart stop in front of them. One of them, a third-year named Chen, held the ambu bag and breathed oxygen into the Admiral's lungs while Natalie's shoulders drove up and down with the mechanical precision of someone who'd performed CPR in a Humvee bouncing across Helmand Province with a bleeding army general in the back. The monitor showed nothing. Asystole. Flat line. A straight line was supposed to mean peaceful, easy death. Instead it meant a heart that had stopped believing in its own purpose. "Where's the attending?" Natalie's voice came out flat, clinical, without the edge that would later make people remember she'd sounded like someone else entirely. "Paging now," Chen said. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. Natalie's forearms burned. Not the burn of weakness but the burn of controlled power, the same sensation she'd felt pulling a wounded flag officer up a mountainside while rounds cracked overhead like angry wasps. Her ribs would bruise him. Her compressions would break 2, maybe 3 of his sternum. But broken ribs meant the chest stayed open, meant the heart got blood, meant the brain didn't die in the 6 minutes it took for irreversible damage. "Still nothing," Chen said. The ambu bag wheezed with compressed air. The room held its breath. 5 residents and a nurse she didn't know, watching a flat line persist. Waiting for the attending. Waiting for the cardiologist. Waiting for permission to do what needed to be done. But that wasn't the worst part. At 0302 hours, Natalie made the calculation. The attending was 15 minutes out. The cardiologist was in Denver, arriving by helicopter if they called now, 23 minutes minimum. The Admiral's brain was already dying. Neurons needed oxygen. Oxygen needed flow. Flow needed a beating heart, and that heart was lying still in a hospital bed in Colorado Springs while she compressed a chest that was getting colder with every passing second. The rule was simple: stay within scope of practice. The rule kept you licensed. The rule kept you employed. The rule was also a death sentence when the person dying was the Admiral whose name was on your forearm and whose mission was the only reason you were still alive. Get me a thoracotomy tray. Now. Her voice had changed. The deference was gone. What remained was command. The room froze. Chen stared. That's a surgical procedure. We can't. Then watch him die. Natalie didn't break rhythm. 30 compressions. The Admiral's ribs bent under her palms. Your choice, resident. My choice is already made. She didn't wait for the tray. Didn't wait for permission. Didn't wait for anyone to realize that a nurse in Colorado Springs shouldn't know how to perform an emergency field thoracotomy, shouldn't have the muscle memory to execute one, shouldn't be reaching down to her ankle where 7 years of hospital shifts couldn't erase the habit of carrying steel. The combat knife came free from its sheath with a sound like a sigh. Blade 4 inches long. Honed sharp enough to split a human hair. She'd carried this knife through Sanjin Valley and Jolin District and a dozen fire support bases that didn't exist on any map. She'd carried it through her transformation from captain to nurse, packed it against her skin like a secret identity waiting to break through scrubs. 1 incision between the 5th and 6th ribs. Her hands moved on their own. The blade knew the angle because the hands remembered. Muscle, fascia, intercostal muscle, she cut through them with surgical precision and combat urgency. The residents gasped. One of them actually stepped back. She was through the chest wall. The pericardium came next, the tough membrane surrounding the heart like a skin. She opened it with a sweep of the blade, and suddenly the Admiral's heart lay exposed in front of her, a 4-chambered muscle the size of her fist, purple and still and very, very dead. Natalie's hand found it. Cradled it. Began the manual massage that she'd learned in a forward surgical team tent and perfected under mortar fire. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. The heart responded like muscle memory recognizing an old friend. Blood began moving through its chambers because her hand was doing the work the electrical system wouldn't do. The monitor jumped. Sinus rhythm. Weak but present. Get me 2 units of O negative. Push 1 milligram epi now. Get me a level 1 rapid infuser. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. The residents moved because authority doesn't require volume when it's delivered by someone with her hands inside a man's chest. The clock read 0318 hours. Natalie would maintain those compressions for 16 hours. Her hands would never leave the Admiral's thoracic cavity. Her fingers would make contact with his heart 4,800 times before any surgeon could take over. The residents would watch in stunned silence as a nurse, just someone in scrubs, performed the procedure that trauma surgeons trained for years to do. What they didn't know was that she'd done it twice before. What they couldn't see was the moment at 0630 when Drive Mercer walked into ICU bed 7 for morning rounds and took in the scene, Natalie with her forearms inside another human being's chest, blood to her elbows, her voice steady as she called out vitals that had no right to be improving, residents monitoring the Admiral's response like monks watching a miracle. For exactly 2 seconds, Mercer understood that he was standing next to someone operating at a level of competence he would never reach. Then he understood something else. He understood opportunity. His phone was in his hand before Natalie had finished the next set of compressions. His voice traveled through the ICU with the precision of someone making a formal statement. "I need to report an emergency violation. This nurse is performing an authorized surgery." "Yes. Right now. ICU bed 7, St. Michael's Hospital." While Natalie's hands maintained their work, compress, release, while her fingers kept the Admiral's heart beating because stopping meant death, Dr. Mercer began the dismantling. One phone call. Another. The residents who'd watched her save the Admiral found themselves suddenly reassigned. Urgent consults in different departments. Different hospitals. Different states. The witnesses scattered like papers in wind. The scheduling system accepted his electronic override. Natalie Hayes removed from Admiral's care team, effective immediately. Her badge access restricted remotely, the system updating in real time as he filed the emergency suspension paperwork, citing gross violation of scope of practice, immediate danger to patients, recommend termination pending board investigation. She couldn't defend herself. Couldn't explain. Couldn't stop compressing his heart long enough to tell the truth because the truth was classified and the Admiral's continued existence depended on her silence. The phone rang at 0837 hours. Hospital security. Escort pending. Badge access revoked. Effective immediately upon completion of this call. 16 hours. That's how long Natalie Hayes kept the Admiral alive with her hands and her training and the combat blade that should never have been in a hospital. 16 hours until a surgeon from Denver finally arrived and took over the manual massage, finally relieved her of the impossible calculation she'd made in the space between heartbeats. By the time they led her out of the ICU, Dr. Mercer was already 3 steps ahead. 16 hours. That was the number that would define everything that came after. At hour 1, when the Admiral's heart had finally caught and held rhythm under her palms, Natalie thought she might collapse from relief. The thoracotomy site was open, exposed, her hands deep in his chest cavity performing what combat medics called a Hail Mary, manual cardiac massage, the most brutal and most effective way to keep a dead man's heart pumping when electricity and drugs had failed. Her fingers found the left ventricle, felt its slack weight, and began the rhythmic compression. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. The rhythm of staying alive. By hour 3, her forearms had begun to burn with a deep muscular ache that spread up into her shoulders. The cardiothoracic surgeon, Dr. Chen, stood across from her, monitoring the Admiral's vitals, adjusting medication drips, occasionally calling out numbers, BP's holding at 92/58, keep going. The residents had been ordered out by Dr. Mercer's standing instructions, something about excessive personnel in trauma zones, but Natalie understood the real message. Witnesses were being removed. Still, she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The Admiral's blood pressure depended on the mechanical action of her hands. Hesitation meant flat line. At hour 4, something shifted. The burning in her forearms transformed into something sharper, a cramping sensation that started in her fingers and radiated upward through her wrists. Her hands wanted to lock, to stop moving, to rebel against the relentless compression. She gritted her teeth and forced through it. 5 years ago in Helmand Province, after carrying the Admiral 3 miles through Taliban fire with a sucking chest wound, she'd learned what her body could do when the alternative was surrender. This was the same. Different battlefield. Same mission. The ICU lights hummed their fluorescent monotone overhead. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, pushing oxygen into lungs that the Admiral's own nervous system no longer controlled. The monitors beeped in a steady staccato, not the rapid warning beep of arrest, not the flatline wail of death, but the patient, persistent rhythm of a man held between worlds by the mechanical action of a woman's hands. Hour 6 came and went. Natalie's vision had begun to narrow slightly, the edges of the room softening with exhaustion. She performed surgery in worse conditions, under mortar fire with sand in the wound site, with 3 hours of sleep in the past 4 days, with the knowledge that if she stopped moving, 16 Marines would die, but the context didn't matter. The body didn't care about context. The body only knew pain and the command to persist. By hour 8, her hands had gone numb. Not the numb of relief, but the numb of disconnection. She could feel the Admiral's ribs beneath her palms, could sense the resistance of his sternum, could read the subtle feedback of tissue and blood and bone, but her fingers themselves had lost sensation. The nerves had shut down, overloaded with signal. She was squeezing his heart with hands that no longer belonged to her, operating on pure instinct and muscle memory. Pain is data, she'd learned in field medicine courses. Numbness meant her hands had moved beyond pain into something more primal, pure neural transmission without the interference of feeling. Dr. Chen was still calling out numbers. Still adjusting. The medications were helping now, epinephrine and calcium chloride working with the mechanical compression to keep the Admiral's heart on the edge of independent function. Twice, it had caught rhythm on its own for maybe 30 seconds before faltering again, slipping back into her hands. But those moments, those brief windows where she felt his heart actually pump beneath her fingers, told her something crucial. His heart wasn't dead. It was just sleeping. Shocked into a rest. Waiting. Hour 10. Hour 11. The world had compressed to the size of the ICU bay, the space between her chest and the Admiral's open thorax, the sensation of flesh and bone under her hands. Everything outside that circle had become abstract. Somewhere in the hospital, Dr. Mercer was making phone calls. Somewhere, orders were being written. Somewhere, people were being reassigned and schedules were being altered. She existed in none of those places. She existed only in the repetitive compression that kept a flag officer breathing. At hour 12, the trembling began. Not fear. Not exhaustion, though her muscles were beyond screaming. This was a different kind of tremor, the fine quivering that comes from a nervous system that has exceeded its reserve. Her hands shook as they worked, trembling with each compression and release, like a seismograph recording the failure of her body to maintain control. She clenched her jaw and forced the tremor into rhythm. Squeeze, release, squeeze, release. The shaking became part of the motion. Her body had learned how to fail and continue simultaneously. Dr. Chen placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're doing incredible work, Nurse Hayes." Nurse Hayes. Not her real title. Not her real name, not really. Just the identity she wore, like the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, a reminder of what she actually was, what she'd actually done, invisible to everyone here. She didn't respond. Responding would require breaking rhythm, would require acknowledging that words existed in the world outside this ICU. There was only the compression. Only the Admiral's heart. Only the 16 hours that would erase her. At hour 14, a man in surgical scrubs she'd never seen before entered the ICU. The cardiothoracic surgeon from Denver, Dr. Yamamoto, flown in by helicopter because the Admiral's condition had triggered a cascade of phone calls that finally reached someone with actual authority. He assessed the situation in 3 seconds, took in the open thorax, the manual cardiac massage, the resident watching the monitors, and the nurse whose hands had been working for 14 hours without relief. He walked directly to the opposite side of the table and positioned his hands near hers. "I don't know who trained you, but don't stop," he said quietly. Then, with a precision that was almost gentle, he took over the compression. His hands moved into position beneath hers, his rhythm matching hers exactly, and she felt the weight transfer. Her hands were still moving, but they were no longer the only hands. They were no longer alone. She didn't stop immediately. She couldn't. Her hands continued the motion for another minute, trembling, before her nervous system accepted that the burden had been shared. Then, slowly, she withdrew, her hands rising from the Admiral's chest cavity. The trembling intensified the moment her hands were free, as if the compression had been the only thing holding the tremor in place. She stepped back, still watching, her blood-stained gloves dripping onto the floor. "Good work," Dr. Yamamoto said without looking at her. His focus was absolute, his hand steady in a way that suggested he'd done this before, many times, in places that didn't ask questions. "Stand by on labs." Hour 16 came at 1900 hours exactly. The Admiral's monitor showed something that hadn't appeared in 14 hours, an independent beat. His own heart, finding its own rhythm, no longer dependent on the mechanical compression. Another beat. Then another. The arrhythmia smoothed, and suddenly there was a rhythm, not perfect, not strong, but real. The Admiral's own heart was beating again. Dr. Yamamoto continued compression for another 30 seconds, letting the rhythm stabilize, confirming that the electrical system had truly reawakened. Then he slowly, carefully withdrew his hands. The heart continued beating. The monitor showed steady rhythm. The Admiral's own physiology had reclaimed function. "Close," Dr. Yamamoto said to the surgical resident. He turned to Natalie, and in his eyes was something like professional respect. "You kept him alive for 16 hours. That takes everything you have." Everything she had. That was exactly what it had taken. The next hours existed in fragmented memory. She'd left the ICU. She'd gone to the scrub room and vomited into a stainless steel sink, her body purging the accumulated adrenaline and exhaustion. She'd washed blood from her forearms under water so hot it felt like ice. She'd dried her hands and watched them tremble as if they belonged to someone else. The unit patch inside her jacket lining, meant to remind her who she was, suddenly felt like a lie. She'd abandoned her post. She'd let them remove her from the only position from which she could protect the Admiral. By 2100 hours, the hospital corridors had taken on the quiet of late evening. Visiting hours had ended. The administrative offices had emptied. And that was when security arrived. 2 officers in grey uniforms, professional and impersonal, holding a folder and wearing expressions that suggested they'd done this before. "Captain," one of them started, then corrected. "Nurse Hayes. We have a suspension notice. Your badge access is revoked, effective immediately. You're to leave the facility and not return pending investigation." The charge nurse, Janet, who'd been kind to her during training, wouldn't meet her eyes as they escorted her through the corridors. Not unkindness. Fear. Fear of association. Fear of the machinery that had been set in motion. Natalie understood. She didn't hate Janet for it. The hospital exit doors opened to the Colorado Springs evening, cool air that felt like a knife after 16 hours in recirculated ICU climate. The security officers walked her to the parking lot, watched her unlock her car, waited until she'd driven away. She had no memory of the drive home. Her hands gripped the steering wheel and her nervous system carried her through familiar roads, but her conscious mind was absent, still in the ICU, still in the Admiral's chest cavity, still performing compressions on a heart that wasn't hers to save anymore. The driveway. Familiar. The house where she'd built a life with her son that was contingent on her being 2 people simultaneously. She sat in the car for 7 minutes without moving, unable to transition between the woman who'd just performed emergency surgery and the woman who needed to walk through that door. Inside, her son was heating pizza. 14 years old. Tall. Growing into his father's shoulders. He turned from the oven as she set her keys on the counter, and his face changed. "Mom? Why are you home early?" She didn't answer. Couldn't find the words that would make sense. "Mom." He came closer. "Are you okay?" She pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down hard, her hands finally still, now that they had nothing to do. The trembling didn't stop. Her hands shook on the kitchen table, visible and undeniable. Her son had never seen her cry. In 14 years, he'd seen her injured, exhausted, stressed, but never broken. Never with tears running down her face while her hands trembled as if she'd been electrocuted. "I failed him," she whispered, and the words meant too many things at once. The Admiral, upstairs in his hospital bed, no longer under her protection because Dr. Mercer had seen his opportunity and taken it. The mission that had just collapsed because her position had been stripped away. The entire reason she'd come to this hospital, placed undercover by naval intelligence to protect a flag officer from an internal threat, and she'd just been removed from the only vantage point from which she could watch for that threat. She'd saved his life 16 hours ago. She'd just lost the ability to keep him alive 16 hours from now. "Mom, what happened?" Her son's voice was young and frightened and entirely unprepared for whatever had just shattered his mother's composure. She couldn't tell him. Couldn't explain the classified assignment, the protected identity, the conspiracy that had just spiraled out of her reach. All she could do was sit at the kitchen table, her hands trembling, and understand that everything had just changed. Her phone buzzed. A hospital notification: Admiral transferred to Naval Medical Center San Diego per physician recommendation. Discharge scheduled 0600 hours. Game over. Her son appeared in the hospital lobby at 0600 hours, holding a frame against his chest like armor. Inside the glass, 2 medals gleamed under fluorescent lighting. The Medal of Honor. The Navy Cross. His 14-year-old hand shook as he read the inscription his mother had taught him phonetically 3 years ago, back when she thought he'd never need to understand what those decorations meant. He didn't know where the press conference was scheduled. Didn't know the Admiral had woken at 0547, his eyes suddenly open, suddenly aware, suddenly searching for the nurse who'd kept him breathing when his heart had stopped. The boy only knew that his mother had been crying at the kitchen table at 2300 hours the night before, her hands still trembling from 16 hours of work she couldn't explain, and that sometimes the truth needs witnesses. The crowd gathered near the main auditorium doors, reporters with cameras, hospital administrators in tailored blazers, military liaisons in dress uniforms standing at parade rest. The Admiral was wheeled through on a gurney wheelchair transition, his face still gaunt but his eyes alert, scanning, searching. The press wanted his statement. The networks wanted footage. Nobody was paying attention to a boy in the lobby until his voice cracked like breaking ice. "Mom. They need to see these." Not a question. A 14-year-old's absolute certainty that the world had gotten something fundamentally wrong, and that evidence could fix it. His voice carried across the tile and echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Heads turned. Cameras pivoted. The Admiral's wheelchair stopped mid-motion, and he went rigid the way men go rigid when they recognize something they thought they'd lost forever. "Phantom," he whispered. The word was barely audible, but it traveled through the lobby like electricity through copper wire. His call sign. Her call sign. The code name from 5 years ago in Helmand Province, whispered in dust and blood when a captain with a trauma shear and a refusal to let him die had dragged his unconscious body 3 miles through Taliban-controlled valleys back to FOB Shank. He'd known her name was Hayes. He'd tattooed it on his forearm as soon as they'd medevaced him stateside. But he'd never known she was here. Never knew she'd come back for him again. The boy walked forward. Nobody stopped him. The frame caught the light as he approached the Admiral, and the Admiral's jaw clenched so hard his whole face trembled. Not fear. Recognition. The kind that comes when the universe corrects a mistake and suddenly the impossible makes absolute sense. A Marine aide stepped forward, reading from a document that had been transmitted to St. Michael's General Hospital less than 40 minutes before. His voice was crisp, military precise, each word a nail being driven into the coffin of every lie Dr. Mercer had constructed. Captain Natalie Hayes, for conspicuous gallantry in Helmand Province, carrying a wounded flag officer 3 miles under fire through hostile territory, demonstrating extraordinary courage and medical competence in extreme conditions. This citation is awarded in recognition of service to this nation and to this officer, personally. Navy Cross, 2019. Medal of Honor, 2020. The boy extended the frame. The Admiral's hands, scarred, weak from coma, but still reaching, took it like it was the most fragile thing in the world. That's when Dr. Mercer pushed through the crowd. He moved with the desperation of a man watching his construction collapse in real time, his voice rising above the reporters' shouted questions. "This is a fraud," he said. "This is impersonation. This woman doesn't have a military record. I have her employment file. I have her nursing credentials. She's a nurse. Just a nurse. Whatever credentials you're claiming." A 2-star general in dress blue stepped forward. Not quickly. With the kind of deliberate, unhurried precision that makes people involuntarily step back. His eyes locked on the medals in the boy's hands, then on the Admiral's face, then on Dr. Mercer with the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed without explanation. He saluted. Not casually. A full military salute, sharp and deliberate, held for exactly 3 seconds. His eyes never left Dr. Mercer's as his fist returned to his side. In that gesture was an entire hierarchy made visible. In that salute was the answer to every question. In that salute was the end of Dr. Mercer's authority. A Pentagon official arrived through the East Corridor entrance, tablet in hand, flanked by 2 men in dark suits whose bearing suggested federal credentials. The official's voice was calm. Administrative. The kind of calm that precedes institutional destruction. Captain Hayes has been verified as personnel on classified protective assignment at this facility under code name Phantom, authorization level top secret SCI, deployed here specifically to address security concerns regarding high-ranking military personnel. He paused, letting the silence do its work. The assignment remains active and classified. All questions regarding her status should be directed through proper military channels. Dr. Mercer's face had gone the color of old parchment. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again, but nothing emerged except a kind of strangled sound that didn't have a name. That's when the hospital IT administrator walked up from the basement server room. Former 101st Airborne, by the patch on his backpack. Former Army signals. The kind of technical specialist who understands that backup systems and redundant servers exist because humans are predictably stupid about destroying evidence. Dr. Mercer, he said, voice steady and professional. I've already reported to Naval Intelligence the 16-hour security footage showing Captain Hayes' resuscitation procedure from 0300 to 1600 hours yesterday. I've also reported the footage from 2047 hours 3 days prior, showing you at the medication cart, hands on the Admiral's for port. He held up a flash drive. Every frame. Every timestamp. Federal agents are in the building right now processing the hospitality suite for forensic evidence. The words landed like rounds downrange. Dr. Mercer turned to run. Security was already moving, positioned at every exit because the federal team had coordinated this the moment the IT specialist had come forward, the moment the backup files had been verified, the moment the pattern had become undeniable. The Admiral had 6 other military patients under Dr. Mercer's care in the past 2 years. 5 unexplained deaths. Medication anomalies. Infection patterns that didn't match standard hospital flora. A systematic targeting of officers high enough in the chain of command to matter, orchestrated by a man who'd seen competence in Natalie Hayes and interpreted it as a threat to his status. They caught him in the parking garage, his hospital badge already deactivated, his office already sealed by federal order, his bank accounts frozen by a CFSA warrant. The news cameras caught it, the doctor in cuffs, the federal agents reading him his rights, the story pivoting from heroic nurse saves Admiral to physician attempted murder of high-ranking military official. The evidence was architectural. The security footage was irrefutable. The conspiracy was exposed completely. Natalie stood in the lobby as the Admiral rolled toward her in his wheelchair, that faded unit patch still sewn inside her jacket lining, pressed against her heart where she'd carried it every single day she'd worked at St. Michael's General. The Admiral reached out. Didn't speak. Just extended his arm and showed everyone in that lobby the Hayes tattoo on his forearm, 5 years old, still unblemished, still perfect, still a promise kept. Her son was crying. The boy who'd arrived with evidence and changed everything was standing beside her now, and she finally had permission to let him see what he'd always suspected. That his mother wasn't just a nurse. That some secrets exist to protect people. That sometimes the quietest people in the room are the ones holding everything together. The Admiral's voice was rough from disuse, carved out of weeks of coma and careful recovery, but when he spoke, everyone heard it. You saved me twice. Once in the dust. Once in the dark. I'm going to spend the rest of my career making sure the world knows who Captain Natalie Hayes is. She didn't smile. Didn't cry. Didn't break. Her composure had been forged in Helmand Province and tested in St. Michael's fluorescent-lit corridors, and it would hold until she was alone, until her son was asleep, until she could finally press her face against that faded unit patch and let the grief and relief and vindication flow through her like water through a broken dam. But standing there in that lobby, with cameras recording and federal agents securing evidence and her son beside her clutching a frame full of medals that finally had a name to attach to them, she allowed herself one small thing. She looked at Dr. Mercer being led out of the hospital in handcuffs, his career imploding in real time, his attempt to destroy her having instead exposed him completely as the internal threat she'd been sent to find. And then Natalie turned back to the Admiral, rolled up her sleeve to show her own matching tattoo, his name, his rank, his service number, inscribed in blue-black ink on her forearm where it had lived for 5 years, and said the only thing that mattered. Welcome back, sir. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet warriors among us. Like and comment if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know who you really were.